I spent 40 winters making sure my son was warm, only to come home and find that he had traded my bed for a coat rack and my dignity for a social climbing guest list. Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. My name is Zaha. I am 68 years old, and my body is a living ledger of every debt I have ever paid to ensure my son never had to know the weight of a heavy tool. I was standing on a windswept construction site in the far north, the kind of place where the sky is the color of a bruised plum and the air tastes of salt and industrial exhaust. The vibration of the jackhammer was still ringing in my bones, a low-frequency hum that had become the soundtrack of my life. My hands, thick and scarred, were cracked from the sub-zero temperatures, the skin looking like old parchment that had been left in the sun too long. I had taken this emergency contract, a brutal, 3-week stint repairing a damaged bridge foundation, because Jordan had mentioned, in that casual, offhand way of his, that his firm was between clients, and Leslie wanted to host a proper summer gala to cement their status in the Highlands. To them, it was a party. To me, it was 21 nights of sleeping in a shipping container and eating lukewarm stew out of a tin can. I didn't mind. I had never minded the dirt. I had spent 40 years believing that my sweat was the oil that kept their world turning. I viewed my exhaustion as a sacrifice on the altar of their legacy. Every time my back spasmed or my knees ground like rusted gears, I would think of Jordan's laugh or the way Leslie looked in the silk dresses my overtime pay bought for her. I thought I was building a bridge to their hearts. I didn't realize I was just building a pedestal for them to stand on while they looked down at me. The job finished 3 days early. The foreman, a man 20 years my junior with eyes full of a strange, pitying respect, handed me the bonus check. "Go home, Zaha," he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that didn't have half the calluses mine did. "A man your age shouldn't be out here in the dark anymore. You've earned a rest." I looked at the check. It was enough to cover the catering, the imported lilies, and the valet service Leslie insisted upon. I smiled, feeling a rare flicker of pride. I thought of the surprise on their faces. I pictured myself walking into the warm, stone-faced mansion I had bought for them, a house with heated floors and a library that smelled of cedar. I imagined Jordan pouring me a drink, his hand on my shoulder, saying, "Good work, Dad. Welcome home." I drove 12 hours straight. I didn't stop for a motel. The adrenaline of the surprise kept my eyes open even as the coffee turned to acid in my stomach. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Highlands estate at midnight. The house was glowing. Every window was a bright, golden rectangle against the black velvet of the night. It looked like a lantern in the wilderness. But as I got closer, I saw the line of luxury cars, German SUVs, Italian sports cars, sleek black Predators that didn't belong in my neighborhood. They were having the party tonight. My heart sank a little. I was covered in the dust of the north. My hair was a mess of gray wires, and my clothes smelled of diesel and damp earth. I didn't want to be a visual stain on their perfect evening. I decided to pull my truck around to the back, near the mudroom. I would slip in, take a hot shower in my suite, and perhaps join them for a quiet drink once the important guests had departed. But as I rounded the corner of the house, my headlights caught something that made my blood turn to slush. There, on the back porch, was a mountain of boxes. My boxes. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my face. I walked toward the pile. My old leather trunk, the one I'd carried across the country when I was a young man. My collection of engineering manuals. The framed photograph of my late wife, Martha, her smile now covered by a thin, shivering layer of plastic tarp. Everything I owned was stacked haphazardly, left out in the frost, as if it were junk waiting for the morning pickup. I felt a cold, jagged spike of confusion. Why were my things outside? Had there been a leak? A fire? I looked toward the far end of the backyard, near the frozen creek. There, tucked under the skeletal branches of a willow tree, sat the old tool shed. It was a drafty, uninsulated structure I had used for lawnmowers and rusted scrap. A dim, flickering light was coming from the single, cracked window of the shed. I walked toward it, my boots crunching on the brittle, frost-bitten grass. The wind howled through the trees, a lonely, morning sound. I reached the shed and peered through the glass. Inside, my twin bed from my suite had been squeezed between a rusted tractor and stacks of damp firewood. My one clean suit was hanging from a rusty nail in the rafters. A small, cheap electric space heater, the kind that couldn't warm a doghouse, was humming in the corner, its orange coil looking like a mocking eye in the dark. I stood there, the midnight frost settling on my shoulders, and the world simply stopped making sense. I had spent 40 years making sure Jordan never knew what it was like to be cold. I had worked 3 jobs in the winter of '98 just to make sure he had a warm coat and a heated classroom. And now, in the twilight of my life, he had moved me into the dirt. I turned back toward the main house. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the formal dining hall offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the festivities. The contrast was a physical blow. Inside, the air was warm and scented with expensive wine. Jordan was there, resplendent in a tuxedo that cost more than my first 3 trucks. He was laughing, his head tilted back, as he spoke to a man in a velvet blazer. Leslie was beside him, her jewelry catching the light like shards of ice, her hand resting on the arm of a woman in a fur stole. I moved closer to the glass, a shadow in the freezing dark, my face inches from the pane. "Oh, the extra space has been a total lifesaver." I heard Leslie's voice through the cracked ventilation pane. Her laughter was high, brittle, and entirely devoid of the warmth she used to show me when I handed her a check. "We were so worried about where to put Julian and Claire. You know how Julian is about his creative space." Luckily, the storage wing cleared up just in time. Jordan's father is away on business. He's a bit of a workaholic, you know, so we've repurposed the area. "And where is the old man staying when he gets back?" the guest asked, swirling a glass of amber scotch that probably cost $50 a pour. Jordan chuckled, and the sound felt like a shard of glass being driven into my ear. "Oh, Dad doesn't care about the aesthetic of the house. He's a man of the earth, you know? He's always telling us how much he misses the raw feeling of the job site. We've set up a cozy little retreat for him in the back. He'll probably think it's a grand adventure. To be honest, he doesn't really fit the vibe when we have the board members over. He's a bit rugged. The smell of the shop tends to linger, you know?" The guest laughed, a wet, entitled sound. "Rugged. That's a polite way of putting it. My father was the same. Useful until they start to look like the help, right?" Jordan didn't defend me. He didn't say, "That man is the reason we aren't living in a trailer." He didn't say, "That rugged man has broken every bone in his body to pay for your wine." He just raised his glass, the light reflecting off his gold watch. "Another gift from me. To progress," Jordan said, "and to a house that finally looks the way it was meant to. Pure, unencumbered luxury." I stood in the mud, my breath coming in ragged, white plumes that vanished into the dark. The temperature was dropping toward 20 degrees, and the moisture from my work clothes was beginning to freeze against my skin. I looked at the shed, where my life had been discarded. I looked at the tractor. I looked at the woodpile. I wasn't a father to them. I wasn't even a human being. I was a logistical problem they had solved by moving me into the cold. I was the clutter that had been cleared away so they could play act as aristocrats. A wave of profound, icy clarity washed over me. I felt the silent architect in me, the part of me that understood load-bearing walls and structural integrity, suddenly see the truth. The house was beautiful, but the foundation was rotten. I had spent my life making sure they were warm, and they had decided that my old age was something to be dealt with alone, in the dark, behind a stack of firewood. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I saw a text from Leslie from 2 days ago, a message I had missed while I was deep in the mud of the north. "Hey Zaha, hope the bridge is going well. Listen, we're having some very high-profile guests over this weekend. We've had to move some of your things to the garden suite to accommodate the overflow. Don't come home early. We need the house to stay perfect, and your style doesn't quite match the theme. Deal with it. See you Monday. Garden suite." I whispered, the words tasting like ash. I looked at the rusted tractor. That was my suite. I didn't burst through the doors. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I simply turned around and walked back to my truck. I didn't even take my boxes. The man who had lived in that house, the man who had loved that son, was dead. He had frozen to death the moment Jordan raised that glass. I sat in the cab of the truck, the engine off, the silence of the backyard pressing in on me. I looked at the bonus check sitting on the dashboard. It was a piece of paper that represented 3 weeks of my life. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer. It was 12:45 a.m., but I had funded his first 3 years of practice when he was just a kid with a dream. He owed me everything. "It's Zaha," I said. My voice was as hard and cold as the frost on the windshield. "I want to initiate the clawback provision on the deed to the Highlands estate. Every cent of the down payment and the monthly mortgage came from my personal business account. It was a conditional gift based on my residency. They violated the condition." "Zaha, what's going on?" "It's the middle of the night. The foundation has failed," I said, watching Jordan through the window as he laughed with a woman who was wearing a necklace that cost 3 of my fingers. "And I want the business accounts for Jordan Vance Consulting frozen by 8 a.m. I am the sole guarantor of his credit line. I want it revoked. All of it. Zaha, this will ruin him. He'll lose everything by the end of the week." "He already lost everything," I said, looking at the shed one last time. "He just doesn't know it yet. He wanted a house that looked perfect. I'm going to make sure it looks exactly the way it should, empty. The deepest betrayal isn't a lie. It's being treated like an inconvenience by the person you sacrificed your life for." Zaha has finally stopped building for others and started protecting himself. Do you think he's being too cold, or did Jordan and Leslie deserve to be left in the dark? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I backed the truck out of the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the garden suite and the pile of my discarded memories. I didn't look back. I drove toward the coast. I had a small cottage there, a place I'd bought for my retirement that Jordan didn't even know existed. The morning after the gala at the Highlands estate was a symphony of gray and cold. The golden glow of the night before had been replaced by a flat, unforgiving light that revealed every stain on the carpet and every crack in the facade. The gilded guests had vanished with the sunrise, leaving behind a graveyard of half-empty glasses and the lingering, sickly sweet scent of expensive floral arrangements that were already beginning to wilt. Jordan stood in the center of the formal dining hall, his tuxedo shirt unbuttoned, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and too much scotch. He was looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the backyard. The frost was still thick on the ground, but the mud where his father's truck had been parked was now just a jagged, frozen scar. "He didn't come back," Jordan muttered to the empty room. Leslie walked in, wrapped in a silk robe that cost 3 of Zaha's double shifts. She was clutching her tablet, her face pale. "Jordan, did you check the guest suite? I mean the shed? I sent a maid out there with some extra blankets this morning, but she said the door was swinging open and the space heater was off. The bed hasn't been slept in." "I know," Jordan said, his voice sounding thin. "I saw the tracks last night. He must have arrived while we were in the middle of the toast. He saw the boxes, Leslie. He saw the shed. So? He's a grown man," Leslie snapped, though her hand was trembling as she swiped through her emails. "He's always bragging about how tough he is. It was just for 3 nights. Julian and Claire are investors, Jordan. We had to prioritize the partnership. Your father would have understood eventually. He always does. He'll show up this afternoon, grumbling about the cold, and then he'll go back to work. That's what he does." But the emotional spark wasn't a fire. It was a sudden, absolute zero. At exactly 8:02 a.m., Jordan's phone began to vibrate on the marble kitchen island. It was a rhythmic, aggressive sound that felt like a countdown. Jordan picked it up. It was a notification from the bank. "Urgent. Line of credit terminated. Reason, guarantor revocation. All corporate accounts frozen pending audit." Jordan's breath hitched. "Leslie, look at this." Before she could respond, another notification chimed. Then another. The process Zaha had initiated was moving through their lives like a silent, predatory virus. Notice of lien filing. Highlands Estate. Claimant, ZHA Vance. Reason, breach of conditional gift agreement. "He's suing us." Leslie gasped, her voice rising to a shrill peak. "He's taking the house? He can't do that. We're his children. This house is ours." "It was never ours," Jordan whispered, the reality finally beginning to bleed through his shock. "He paid the down payment. He signed the mortgage. We just lived in it. I thought he'd never call the debt. I thought he was just the invisible provider." The phone rang. It was Julian, the important guest from the night before. "Jordan, what the hell is going on?" Julian's voice was stripped of its silk. "My lawyers just called. The merger funding for the boutique firm? The escrow account has been flagged for suspicious source withdrawal. The money is gone, Jordan. If this isn't fixed by noon, the deal is dead. And my father is going to make sure you never work in this city again. Julian, wait, there's been a mistake. Click. Jordan stared at the dead screen. He looked out at the backyard again. The shed sat there, small and pathetic under the willow tree. For the first time, Jordan didn't see it as a logistical solution. He saw it for what it was, a cage. A cage he had tried to put his own father in. We have to find him, Jordan said, his voice cracking. We have to go to the shop. He's probably there, waiting for us to apologize. He just wants to see us crawl, Leslie. That's what this is. A power play. He's just an old man with hurt feelings. Then let's go, Leslie shouted, already running toward the stairs to get dressed. We'll tell him we were just protecting the legacy. We'll tell him we'll move his things back in today. He'll cave. He always caves when he sees me cry. They scrambled into their luxury SUV, the engine roaring to life with a mechanical confidence they no longer felt. They drove toward the industrial district, the part of the city they usually avoided because of the smell and the grit. As they pulled up to Vance's heavy repairs, the gates were locked. A heavy, iron chain had been wound around the entrance. A bright orange notice was taped to the fence. Property closed until further notice. Liquidation in progress. Jordan jumped out of the car and ran to the gate, shaking the chain. Dad, open up. It's Jordan. Old man Miller, the neighbor from the scrapyard, walked over to the fence. He was chewing on a toothpick, his eyes full of a dark, satisfied amusement. He ain't here, kid. Where is he, Miller? Give me the keys. I need to talk to him. Miller leaned against the fence, spitting a bit of tobacco onto the gravel. He told me you'd show up. Said you'd be wearing a fancy suit and a desperate look. He told me to give you a message. What message? Leslie cried, stepping out of the car. Miller looked at her, his eyes sliding over her silk robe and her designer sunglasses. He said, the garden suite is open, but the rent is 40 years of your life. Since you don't have that kind of currency, I've decided to move the business to a place where the air is cleaner. Where did he go? Jordan shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the shop. He didn't say, Miller said. But he did take the ledger. The one with all the receipts for your college, your wedding, and that fancy car you're driving. He said he's going to use it as a manual for his new life. A manual on how to say no. Jordan fell back against the fence, his knees finally giving out. He looked at the locked shop. This was the place that had funded every dream he'd ever had. Every steak dinner, every designer watch, every consulting fee he'd charged to clients who only hired him because of his father's reputation for honesty. The emotional spark was no longer a shock. It was a fire that was consuming everything he owned. He looked at Leslie, who was frantically calling her parents, only to be met with voicemails. Her high society support system was evaporating the moment the money stopped flowing. He's really gone, Jordan whispered. He can't be. Leslie screamed, kicking the gravel. He's 68. He has no one. He has to come back. Who's going to take care of him? He's been taking care of himself for 40 years, Leslie, Jordan said, looking at his own soft, manicured hands. He was taking care of himself while he was taking care of us. We just didn't notice because he never complained. They sat in the car for hours, watching the empty shop. The silence was the loudest thing Jordan had ever heard. It was the sound of a foundation being removed. He thought of the shed in the backyard, the freezing, dark, lonely shed. He imagined his father standing there, looking through the window at the party. The bomb Zaha had dropped wasn't the lawsuit or the frozen accounts. It was the silence. The absolute, unwavering silence of a man who had finally stopped being a bridge. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the industrial yard, Jordan's phone buzzed one last time. It was an automated message from the estate's security system. Notice, utility disconnection scheduled for 6 p.m. Reason, non-payment by account holder. The lights, Jordan said, his voice a ghost. He's turning off the lights. The house in the highlands, the lantern in the wilderness, was about to go dark. And for the first time in their lives, Jordan and Leslie were going to have to figure out how to find their way in the cold. Zaha didn't just take his money. He took his presence, leaving Jordan and Leslie to face the world they built without him. Do you think this tough love is the only way to make a child realize their entitlement, or has Zaha gone too far by ruining their careers? Share your perspective in the comments. I'm curious where you draw the line. The car sat in the dark. Jordan looked at the dashboard. He had 3 miles of gas left. He didn't have his father's credit card anymore. He didn't have the Vance name to protect him. He was just a man in a tuxedo, sitting in the mud, finally beginning to understand what it meant to deal with it alone. Behind them, the industrial district was closing down for the night. Ahead of them, the road to the highlands was a long, black ribbon of uncertainty. The emotional spark had done its work. The facade was gone. Now, there was only the cold. Resistance is not always a loud rebellion. Sometimes, it is the desperate, clawing denial of a person sliding off a cliff. For Jordan and Leslie, the first 48 hours of their new reality were spent in a fever dream of fixing it. They refused to believe the bridge had been burned. They simply thought there was a mechanical failure they could bypass with enough social maneuvering. They returned to the Highlands estate to find the lantern had indeed gone dark. The grand stone facade, which had looked so regal under the gala lights, now looked like a tomb. Without the climate control, the house had already begun to hold the damp chill of the earth. "It's a bluff," Leslie said, her breath visible in the darkened foyer. She was still wearing her silk robe, now stained and wrinkled. "He's a father. Fathers don't ruin their sons. He's just waiting for us to call and beg. He wants to feel powerful because we made him feel small. We just have to play the game." Jordan didn't answer. He was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, his phone plugged into a portable battery pack. He was watching the resistance play out in his inbox. From Hawthorne and Associates, Legal, Re. Immediate eviction notice. Mr. Vance, as the primary account holder, Zaha Vance has terminated the residency agreement. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before local authorities are dispatched. Any removal of fixtures or high-value assets purchased by the guarantor will be treated as grand larceny. "He's evicting us," Jordan whispered. The word felt heavy, like a stone in his mouth. "He's not bluffing, Leslie. He's clearing the site. Then we fight." Leslie snapped. She grabbed the phone from his hand. "We'll tell the court he's mentally unfit. We'll say the stress of the bridge job caused a breakdown. A man doesn't just wake up and destroy his family unless he's lost his mind. We'll get a temporary restraining order and freeze the clawback until we can get a psychiatric evaluation." This was their resistance, the attempt to pathologize Zaha's dignity. They couldn't accept that he was a man making a choice. They had to believe he was a machine that had malfunctioned. They spent the next 12 hours calling every friend who had been at the gala. They called Julian. They called Claire. They called the board members. But the social divide was now a fortress they were on the wrong side of. In the high society circles they craved, financial instability was a contagious disease. No one picked up. Their friends weren't just busy. They had already erased Jordan and Leslie from their contact lists. By the second night, the house was a freezer. They had moved into the small library, huddling under expensive cashmere throws that were useless against the bone-deep cold. "Call him again," Leslie commanded. "Tell him I'm sick. Tell him the stress has put me in the hospital. He's always had a soft spot for me, Jordan. Remind him of the time I helped him with his taxes." "You didn't help him with his taxes, Leslie," Jordan said, his voice flat. "You took his receipts to an accountant and charged his business account for the consulting fee." He knew. He always knew. Jordan dialed the number. Ring, ring, ring. It was the same every time. The silence on the other end felt like a physical barrier. Jordan began to leave a message, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Dad, look, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. We're sitting in a dark house with no heat. Is this what you want? To see your son on the street? We'll move the boxes back, okay? We'll give you the master suite. Just stop the legal process. Julian is threatening to sue me for millions. You're destroying my life, Dad. Pick up the phone." He waited. He listened to the static on the line. "He's not listening," Jordan said, dropping the phone. "He's gone. He's truly, fundamentally gone. He's in that cottage," Leslie said, her eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. "The one near the coast. He thinks he's safe there? He thinks he can just hide while we lose everything? We're going there, Jordan. We aren't calling anymore. We're going to show up, and we aren't leaving until he signs the papers." They didn't have gas for the SUV, and their credit cards were pieces of dead plastic. They were forced to do something they hadn't done since college. They took the bus. The journey to the coast was a 4-hour descent into a world they had spent a decade mocking. Sitting on the cracked vinyl seats of a public bus, surrounded by people who smelled of laundry detergent and hard work, the social divide became a physical ache. They looked at the other passengers, a nursing student, a man in a faded work jacket, a woman with a crying child, and they didn't see the help anymore. They saw a mirror. "I hate him," Leslie whispered, staring out the window at the passing gray fields. "I hate that he's making us live like this. It's a humiliation. It's an abuse." "Is it?" Jordan asked. He was looking at his own hands. They were soft. They were clean. They were the hands of a man who had never had to fight for a breath of air. "We told him to deal with old age alone, Leslie. We told him he was rugged and disgraceful in front of people who didn't even know his name. We were the ones who moved his life into a tool shed. It was a logistics decision." Leslie screamed, her voice drawing looks from the other passengers. "It wasn't personal." "Everything is personal to a man who spends 40 years building your world," Jordan said. They reached the crossroads near the coast at 11 p.m. The wind was a howling banshee, whipping off the Atlantic with enough force to knock them sideways. They had to walk the 3 miles to the cottage. The road was a jagged line of gravel and mud. Leslie's designer boots, meant for marble floors and manicured lawns, fell apart within the first mile. She was forced to walk in her stockings, the cold mud seeping through the fabric until her feet were numb blocks of ice. "I'm going to sue him for emotional distress," she sobbed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm going to take every penny he has left." "With what lawyer, Leslie?" Jordan asked. "We don't even have $1 for a cup of coffee." They reached the Blue Horizon cottage at midnight. It sat on the edge of the cliff, a small, stubborn lighthouse against the storm. The windows were dark, but a thin curl of smoke was rising from the chimney. Jordan hammered on the door. "Dad, open up. It's US. We know you're in there." The door didn't open. The resistance of the house was absolute. "Zha," Leslie screamed, kicking the door. "You can't do this. We're family. You're a monster. Look at me. I'm freezing." Suddenly, the porch light flickered on. The yellow glow revealed them in their true state. 2 aristocrats covered in mud, shivering, their expensive clothes now little more than rags. Zaha didn't open the door. He opened the small, screened window at the top of the door. "The bus back to the city leaves at 6 a.m. Zaha's voice came through the screen. It was a voice from a great distance, not of miles, but of the heart. "I suggest you start walking now. It's a long way in the dark." "Dad, please," Jordan cried, his hands pressed against the wood. "The house is dark. The bank is taking everything. Julian is going to ruin me. Just sign the gifts and transfers affidavit. Tell them the Highlands was a permanent gift. It's just one signature." "I already signed a signature," Zaha said. "I signed 40 years of paychecks that you used to buy a life you didn't earn. My hand is tired, Jordan. It won't hold a pen for you anymore. You're killing US." Leslie shrieked. "Do you want to see us on the street? Is that it? You want to see your daughter-in-law in a shelter?" "I lived in a shipping container for 3 weeks, so you could have a party," Zaha said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. "I lived in a basement apartment for 10 years so Jordan could have a degree. I've lived on the street of your heart for a long time, Leslie. I think you'll find the garden suite is quite spacious once you get used to the cold." "Dad, I'm sorry," Jordan shouted, his voice breaking into a sob. "I'm sorry about the shed. I'm sorry about the gala. Just let us in. We'll change everything." "You won't change," Zaha said. "You'll just wait until the bank accounts are full again, and then you'll find a new aesthetic that doesn't include me. You aren't sorry for what you did. You're sorry that the invisible man finally decided to be seen." The porch light clicked off. "Zaha." "No." The silence returned, heavier than the wind. They stood on the porch, 2 ghosts in the dark, pounding on a door that would never open again. The resistance was over. The realization was setting in. The man they had discarded was the only thing that had been keeping the world from crushing them. And he was gone. There is a difference between remorse and regret. Jordan is regretting the loss of his money, but is he truly feeling remorse for his father's pain? If you were Zaha, would you let them in for one night to keep them from freezing? Or is the tough love the only way to make them grow? Let's have a deep discussion in the comments. Jordan and Leslie sat on the porch steps, huddling together for warmth. They looked out at the Atlantic, the black waves crashing against the rocks. They had spent their lives looking up at penthouses and gala lights. Now, they were looking at the raw, indifferent edge of the world. The garden suite was everywhere now, and for the first time in 68 years, Zaha was sleeping in a warm bed, listening to the sound of the ocean, finally, fundamentally, alone. The Atlantic did not merely rain that night, it waged a war. The Blue Horizon cottage, perched precariously on the cliff's edge, began to groan under the weight of a nor'easter that had turned the rain into horizontal shards of ice. Outside, the world was a black, swirling void where the line between the sky and the sea had been erased by the fury of the gale. On the porch, Jordan and Leslie were no longer people. They were shivering animals. The cashmere throws they had scavenged from the house in the highlands were soaked through, heavy and useless, smelling of wet goat and desperation. Jordan's teeth were chattering with a rhythmic, mechanical sound that he couldn't stop. Leslie had stopped screaming. She was curled in a ball against the doorframe, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs. Inside, Zaha sat by the cast-iron stove. He could hear them. He could hear the scratching at the wood, the soft whimpers that the wind couldn't quite swallow. He looked at his hands, those thick, scarred hands. They were warm. For 40 years, he had used them to keep the world away from his family. He had been the insulation, the shield, the buffer. The forced proximity began not with an invitation, but with a structural failure. A massive gust of wind, 100 miles an hour of raw ocean power, slammed into the cottage. A shutter on the western window shattered, and the porch's outer railing groaned and snapped, disappearing into the abyss below. Zaha stood up. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of the code. You do not leave a living thing to be taken by the sea. He unhooked the door. The wind practically threw Jordan and Leslie inside. They spilled onto the wooden floor like a heap of laundry, bringing the scent of the storm and the freezing mud with them. Zaha slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy iron bolt. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the roar of the wind against the shingles and the frantic, animal-like gasping of his son. "Strip off the wet clothes," Zaha said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth they had once taken for granted. "There are wool blankets in the chest. Move." They didn't argue. The senior partner and the socialite were gone. In their place were two broken children, stripping off thousands of dollars of ruined silk and wool in the flickering orange light of the stove. They wrapped themselves in the rough, scratchy blankets Zaha provided. These weren't the soft, $500 throws from the highlands. These were industrial-grade wool, smelling of cedar and age. Zaha moved to the kitchenette. He didn't look at them. He moved with a practiced, economical grace, boiling water on the stove and throwing in a handful of cheap, loose tea. "Dad," Jordan started, his voice a ghost of itself. "The storm, it's worse than the news said." "The news doesn't live on the coast," Jordan, Zaha said, placing 2 tin mugs of hot tea on the table. "Drink. It'll stop the core from freezing." They huddled at the table, their hands shaking so violently that the tea splashed over the rims. The forced proximity was absolute. In this small, one-room cottage, there was no guest wing. There was no garden suite. There was only the fire, the tea, and the man they had tried to exile. "We saw the legal notice," Leslie whispered, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug. She looked smaller, her expensive hair matted to her head like a drowned bird's feathers. "The eviction. The accounts. Zaha, you're taking everything. We have nowhere to go. We have no money." "You have exactly what I had when I started in 1980, Zaha said. He sat in his rocking chair, the wood creaking a slow, steady rhythm. "You have your health, you have your hands, and you have the clothes on your back. The only difference is, I had a purpose. I had a son I wanted to protect. You only have a vibe you want to maintain. That's not fair." Jordan snapped, a flicker of the old resistance returning. "We worked hard for our reputation. I spent years building that consulting firm. With my reputation as collateral," Zaha countered. "Every client you signed did so because they knew the Vance name meant honesty. They thought you were made of the same steel I was. But the moment you moved my life into a shed to impress a man like Julian, you proved you were made of something else. Something soft. Something that dissolves in the rain." The wind hammered the house again, the rafters screaming. A leak began to drip from the ceiling, the water hitting the floor with a rhythmic plink, plink, plink. "Fix it," Zaha said, pointing to the leak. What? Jordan looked at him, confused. The leak. There's a bucket and a roll of sealant in the corner. Fix it, or the floor rots and the house fails. That's how life works, Jordan. It's not a logistical decision. It's a nail and a hammer. Jordan stood up, his legs trembling. He walked to the corner and picked up the bucket. He looked at the ceiling, then back at the bucket, completely lost. He had never fixed a thing in his life. He didn't know how to find a joist. He didn't know how to stop the water. He stood there, a man in a $3,000 tuxedo shirt wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at a leak as if it were a foreign language. I don't know how, Jordan whispered. Then watch, Zaha said. He didn't get up. Watch the water fall. Watch the house die. Because that's what you did to us. You watched the foundation of our family rot because you were too busy looking at the paint on the walls. Leslie began to cry then. It wasn't the performative, manipulative crying she had used for years. It was the low, keening sound of someone who had finally realized the depth of their own poverty. Not of money, but of soul. We're sorry, she sobbed. Zaha, please. We were wrong. The shed, it was a mistake. We were stressed. We didn't think. You thought perfectly, Zaha said. You calculated exactly what you thought I was worth. You weighed my 40 years of labor against Julian's privacy, and you decided the labor was worth a shed. You didn't make a mistake, Leslie. You made a choice. And tonight, the choice is mine. The forced proximity intensified as the night wore on. The storm grew so loud they had to shout to be heard. The cottage felt like a ship lost at sea, pitching and yawning in the dark. Jordan and Leslie were forced to sit on the floor by the stove, the only place where the heat could reach them. They were literal feet away from the man they had treated like a ghost. Jordan looked at his father's boots. They were old, caked with the mud of the north, but they were solid. He looked at his own shoes, patent leather, now ruined by the salt and the mire. Why did you do it, Dad? Jordan asked suddenly. Why did you work so hard if you were just going to take it all back? Zaha looked at his son. For the first time, a flicker of something like grief crossed his face. I didn't work to give you a mansion, Jordan, Zaha said. I worked to give you a character. I thought that if you saw me endure, you would learn to endure. I thought that if you saw me provide, you would learn to provide. But somewhere along the way, the things became more important to you than the man who made them. You started to love the gift and loathe the giver. Zaha stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the blackness. I took it back because the money was a poison, Zaha said. It made you think you were better than the work. It made you think you could put your own father in the cold and still sleep in a warm bed. I took it back to save you from becoming the kind of person I spent my life protecting you from. But we have nothing now. Leslie cried. You have the truth, Zaha said. And in this storm, that's the only thing that's going to keep you from being swept over the cliff. The three of them stayed in that room, the senior partner, the socialite, and the mechanic, trapped together by the sea. There was no escape, no lawyers, no Julian, just the fire, the silence, and the howling of a world that didn't care about their aesthetic. Forced proximity has a way of stripping away the lies. Jordan and Leslie are finally seeing that without Zaha's grease, their gold is worthless. Do you think Zaha should use this time to teach them how to fix the house? Or is he right to let them sit in their own helplessness? Let's hear your take in the comments. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the wind shifted. The cottage gave a final, violent shudder. The leak in the ceiling grew into a steady stream. Jordan, without being told, stood up and placed the bucket under the water. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start. Zaha watched him. He didn't offer a hand. He just sat in his chair, a silent architect watching his foundation finally, painfully, begin to reset. The fire in the cast-iron stove began to settle, the orange glow pulsing like a dying star. Outside, the storm had reached a fever pitch, the wind screaming through the eaves of the cottage with a sound that felt like a human voice in agony. Jordan sat on the floor, his eyes fixed on the bucket he had placed under the leak. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop was a second of his life ticking away, a reminder of the silence he had maintained while his father was pushed into the dark. You think you know how you got that house, don't you, Jordan? Zaha's voice came from the shadows. He hadn't moved from his rocking chair. He looked like a statue carved from the very cliff the cottage sat upon. You bought it for us, Jordan said, his voice small and hollow. You said it was a wedding gift. You said you'd had a good year at the shop. Zaha gave a short, Mirthless laugh. A good year. Jordan, I haven't had a good year since 2007. I've had years where I survived and years where I didn't. But I never had a year that could pay for a $3 million estate in the Highlands. Leslie looked up from her wool blanket, her face pale. Then where did the money come from, Zaha? If it wasn't the shop, then whose money have we been spending? Zaha stood up slowly. He walked to a small, built-in wooden cabinet and pulled out a heavy, battered metal lockbox. He brought it to the table and set it down with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the thunder outside. He didn't open it immediately. He let his hand rest on the lid, his thick, scarred fingers tracing the scratches in the metal. 10 years ago, Zaha began, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. You had that accident, Jordan. Do you even remember it? Or were you too busy dreaming of your first Ferrari? Jordan stiffened. The crash. I was 22. A driver hit me on the highway. I was in the ICU for a month. The driver didn't hit you, Jordan, Zaha said, his eyes locking onto his son's. You hit a bridge abutment because you were driving a car I shouldn't have bought you, at a speed you weren't ready for. You were at fault, and the medical bills were only half the problem. The lawsuit from the city for the structural damage and the private insurance clawback was going to put you in prison for vehicular negligence. You were going to lose your law license before you even passed the bar. Jordan's breath hitched. He remembered the hospital, the white lights, the morphine haze, but he had always been told the legal side just worked itself out. I didn't have the money to fix it, Zaha whispered. I had the shop, and I had my pride, and that was it. So I went to a man I'd spent my life avoiding. A man named Silas. He's a private lender in the industrial district. The kind of man who doesn't use banks. He uses blood. Zaha opened the lockbox. Inside weren't gold bars or bank statements. It was filled with yellowed, handwritten ledgers and a single, thick document with a dark red seal. He pushed the document across the table. Read the interest rate, Jordan, Zaha commanded. Jordan looked at the paper. His eyes widened. 30%? Dad, this is predatory. This is illegal. It's only illegal if you plan on living to see the end of the loan, Zaha said. I signed my life over to Silas. I agreed to work every black market repair job he had. For 10 years, every time I told you I was away on a business trip, I was actually in a windowless warehouse in the docks, repairing stolen heavy machinery for people who would have killed me if I'd slipped. I wasn't expanding the business. I was paying for your freedom. I was paying to keep your name clean so you could become a senior partner. Leslie reached for a ledger, her fingers trembling. And the Highlands house. If you were in debt, how did you buy the house? That's the part that really hurts, Zaha said, looking at the ceiling. 5 years ago, Silas died. His son took over the debt. He didn't want the interest. He wanted the land the shop sits on. It's prime real estate for the new shipping terminal. He offered me a trade, the land and my permanent silence, in exchange for a cleared debt and a $3 million exit payment. He wanted me to retire and disappear. Zaha leaned forward, his face illuminated by the dying fire. I took the money. I gave up the shop's future. I gave up the only thing I truly owned, the earth I worked on. And I used every cent of that exit payment to buy the Highlands estate. I thought, if I can't give him a legacy of work, I'll give him a legacy of status. I thought the house would be a fortress for you. I thought it would make you feel like the world was yours. You sold the shop for us. Jordan whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The shop wasn't just a business. It was Zaha's soul. It was the only place he had ever been happy. I didn't sell it for you, Jordan, Zaha said, his voice breaking for the first time. I sold it for the idea of you. I sold it so I could see you stand in that grand foyer and feel like a king. I wanted one part of this family to be clean. I wanted one of us to not have grease under our nails. He looked at Jordan, his eyes full of a devastating, quiet fury. And then I came home early, and I saw that my king had moved my life into a shed. I realized that the house I had traded my soul for was being used as a tool to shame me. I realized that by protecting you from the dirt, I had made you into a man who despised the very dirt I was made of. The silence in the cottage was absolute. Even the storm seemed to hesitate. Jordan looked at the document, the blood loan, and then at his father's hands, the hands that had worked in windowless warehouses while Jordan was playing golf with Julian. He looked at the ledger. October 14th, 2018, Jordan's firm launch, $50,000. Worked 48 hours straight on a seized freighter engine. Lung infection. December 22nd, 2021. Highlands down payment, $1.2 million. Closed the shop sale. Signed the silence agreement. You're not a senior partner, Jordan, Zaha said, his voice a low growl. You're a tenant in a house built on my silence. And the moment you told me to deal with old age alone in that shed, you broke the only contract that mattered, the one between a father and a son. Jordan fell to his knees. The Highlands mask didn't just crack. It vanished, leaving behind a man who was finally seeing the true cost of his life. He looked at Leslie, who was staring at the floor, the socialite facade replaced by a deep, hollow shame. Dad. Jordan choked out, the tears finally coming. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know about Silas. I didn't know about the shop. You didn't want to know, Zaha said. You liked the golden light. You didn't want to think about the fuel that kept the lamp burning. But the fuel is gone now, Jordan. I've triggered the clawback, not because I want the money. The money is cursed, but because I want the truth. I want you to know what it feels like to have no house, no firm, and no invisible provider to clean up your messes. Zaha stood up and walked toward his small bedroom. The storm will break by dawn. The bus will be at the crossroads. I suggest you use the walk to figure out who you are when you aren't spending my blood. There is no heavier burden than the realization that your success was built on someone else's suffering. Zaha hid the truth to protect Jordan, but did that protection actually destroy Jordan's character? If you were Jordan, how would you even begin to earn back the respect of a father who gave up everything for you? Let's have an honest conversation in the comments. The door to the bedroom shut, the click of the latch sounding like the final period on a 40-year sentence. Jordan and Leslie stayed on the floor of the cottage, huddled by a fire that was nearly out, surrounded by the yellowed papers of a life that had been sold piece by piece to keep them warm. The backstory was unveiled. The garden suite was gone. And for the first time in his life, Jordan Vance was truly, terrifyingly, in the dark. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.